November 28, 1950, 4 a.m. The temperature at the Chosin Reservoir had already dropped below -30 Celsius, and the wind was a living thing, cutting through uniforms and flesh with methodical cruelty. Major Pavel Danilov, a Soviet military advisor attached to the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, stood in the frozen command post, watching the tactical map laid out on the heavy wooden table. His breath came in white clouds. His hands, even in thick fur gloves lined with rabbit fur, had begun to lose sensation. The heater in the corner of the bunker was burning charcoal, filling the space with a sickly warmth that never quite reached the extremities. But the situation on the map before him was electrifying in a way that transcended physical discomfort. The Americans had made a catastrophic mistake. They had pushed too far north. They had stretched their supply lines impossibly thin across mountain passes that were now being sealed by Chinese forces. Worst of all, they had done it with armor that was already considered obsolete before the war even began. Danilov was 47 years old, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany, a man who had seen the T-34 tank shatter German panzer formations and change the nature of armored warfare forever. He had been hand-picked by the General Staff for this assignment because his expertise in tank operations was considered unparalleled among Soviet advisors. The statistics he was reviewing were brutal in their clarity. The Americans possessed approximately 230 tanks in the operational zone around the Chosin Reservoir. Of these, the majority were M4 Sherman tanks, vehicles that had been designed in 1941 and were now nearly a decade old, long past their technological prime. Some Sherman variants carried the new 76mm gun, a more powerful weapon that was theoretically a match for what the Chinese possessed. But most still mounted the older 75mm cannon, a gun that had been considered adequate in 1942, but was now distinctly mediocre. The newer M46 Patton tanks, the ones with slightly better armor and firepower, numbered perhaps 40 in total, scattered through the American force as a thin leavening of modernity. Against this force, Danilov had coordinated the positioning of 800 T-34-85 tanks, equipped with the powerful 85mm gun, and another 300 T-34-76s held in reserve further back. The ratio was nearly 4-1 in the Chinese favor. The T-34, which had shocked the Germans with its revolutionary sloped armor in 1941, was still widely considered the dominant tank in the world. It was heavier than the Sherman, faster than the Sherman, and mounted a more powerful gun than the American M4. According to the calculations that had been run meticulously in Moscow by the finest strategic minds available, the numbers were not even close. Mathematically, the Americans should have been destroyed already. They should have been cut off, surrounded, and annihilated within 72 hours. But something was profoundly wrong with the reports coming back from the front. The Chinese commanders were supposed to be executing a classic hammer and anvil operation that Danilov himself had helped plan during late-night strategy sessions in the warmth of the Corps headquarters. The hammer would come from the north and east, crushing the extended American column against the anvil of geography. The Americans would be trapped in the mountains with no escape route, no possibility of resupply, and no hope of relief. The first reports arriving on the morning of the 28th were positive. The Americans were retreating, or so it appeared. Good. A retreat meant they were panicked. A retreat meant their formations were fragmenting. A retreat meant the end was near. But as dawn broke over the frozen landscape and the pale light revealed the white-covered ridges stretching in all directions, the rhythm of the incoming signals began to change in ways that troubled Danilov deeply. At 6:15 a.m., The first truly alarming report arrived via field telephone. An entire Chinese regiment had been mauled near the village of Xinhongyi. Not pushed back, not delayed by temporary defensive positions, mauled. The regimental commander had been killed, along with his headquarters staff. The regiment's surviving personnel had fallen back in disorder. The signal officer relayed a confused account from the survivors. The Americans had formed a defensive perimeter with their tanks arranged in a circle, the classic wagon train formation that Danilov had read about in military histories, but had never expected to see employed against the T-34. When the Chinese infantry surged forward in waves, as they had been trained to do, riding on the momentum of surprise and numerical superiority, the American tanks had opened fire not with the tentative, intermittent accuracy that Soviet intelligence reports said the M4 should possess, but with rapid, devastating volleys that had the precision of surgical instruments. Entire platoons of Chinese soldiers were being erased in seconds. The Chinese anti-tank guns that were supposed to suppress the American armor were being destroyed before they could even get into position. It was as if the American crews knew exactly where the Chinese would be, exactly when they would appear, exactly how to place their fire for maximum effect. Danilov's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. This was not the behavior of men operating obsolete equipment, desperate for survival. This was the behavior of experienced crews who had learned something about their machines and about the terrain that exceeded any specifications written in Moscow. This was professional. This was calculated. He called for General Chen, the Chinese army commander, a man in his 50s whose patience had been wearing thin with the Soviet advisors who had promised a quick victory and who had assured higher command in Beijing that American forces would collapse under the weight of superior numbers. When Chen arrived at 7:30 a.m., his face was dark with barely contained fury. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperatures, a sign of the stress he was under. "Major, your calculations are wrong," Chen said in careful Russian, each word clipped and precise. "The Americans are not breaking. They are consolidating. They are forming a defensive line rather than attempting breakthrough to the north as we predicted. It is as if they know they are surrounded and they are accepting the encirclement. This is not the behavior of a defeated force. This is the behavior of men who believe they can hold until relief arrives." Danilov studied the map intently, his mind racing through variables and contingencies. If the Americans had decided to stand rather than break through toward friendly territory, it meant they believed they could hold long enough for relief columns to cut through the mountains. But relief was still 60 kilometers away, separated by terrain that was becoming more hostile by the hour as Chinese forces dug in. It meant they believed they could hold against 800 tanks with 200 of their own. It made no tactical sense unless they possessed some advantage that was not reflected in any of the intelligence summaries that had been prepared. Over the next 48 hours, the mathematical certainty that had defined Soviet strategic planning began to crumble like the frozen ground beneath the tanks. By 2 p.m. on November 29th, the answer began to emerge in fragments from interrogated prisoners, from observation posts, from the confused reports of Chinese commanders who simply could not explain their mounting casualties. American tankers were reporting that their vehicles were being hit repeatedly by Chinese anti-tank guns, by recoilless rifles, by infantry carrying shaped charges that should have been devastating, but the crews were surviving. Shrapnel was penetrating the armor. Shells were striking the vehicles with force that should have been lethal. But penetration was not universal. The hits that should have been catastrophic were often merely incapacitating. The Chinese would destroy a Sherman, damage its gun, or destroy a tread, and the Americans would abandon the vehicle, only to have the crew extract themselves and continue fighting. More significantly, there were reports of an unexpected tactical phenomenon that the Chinese commanders found baffling. When American tanks took defensive positions on slightly higher ground, even marginally elevated terrain that conventional doctrine would have considered insignificant, the T-34s, struggling to engage them, found themselves operating at a severe and seemingly inexplicable disadvantage. The Chinese tankers were filing complaints that their guns would not depress far enough to hit targets positioned below them on the slopes. The Americans, conversely, could angle their guns downward with ease and engage from positions that offered superior observation and superior firing angles. It was as if the two tanks had been designed for warfare in different types of terrain. The T-34, built on the flat testing grounds of Russia and the desert expanse of the training areas near the Caspian, struggled with the mountainous terrain of Korea in ways that the American designers seemed to have anticipated. At 4:45 p.m. on November 30th, Danilov realized with growing unease that he was observing a phenomenon that directly contradicted the entire theoretical framework of armored warfare as the Soviet Union understood it. The T-34 was supposed to be invincible in frontal engagement. It had proven this against German tanks. It had proven this during the Hungarian uprising earlier that year. Yet American crews in inferior tanks seemed to be evading direct combat, using terrain with sophistication, refusing to play the game of straight tank versus tank duels. They were being evasive. They were being calculating. They were being something that Soviet doctrine did not account for. They were being individually adaptive. They were thinking like soldiers, not like mechanisms. On December 1st, 10:30 a.m., a T-34-85 that had been partially disabled by American anti-tank fire and then abandoned by its Chinese crew was captured by an American patrol. The tank was towed back to a secure location behind American lines, and then, through a series of complex negotiations and intelligence exchanges that would remain classified for decades, arrangements were made for Danilov to examine it. Soviet advisors did not normally have access to captured enemy equipment, but the circumstances were unusual. The Major examined the vehicle with cold, analytical eyes. It was a magnificent machine. Its sloped frontal armor was thicker than anything the M4 possessed. Its gun was more powerful. The silhouette was low and aggressive. Yet American crews in M4 Shermans, tanks that were objectively inferior in nearly every measurable specification, had somehow managed to disable and capture it. Danilov ordered the tank moved to a secure facility and summoned his technical team, specialists in armor and gunnery, who had been attached to the advisory mission. The investigation began immediately at 2 p.m. The mechanics examined the external damage with meticulous care. There were hits, multiple hits on the sloped frontal armor. Most had ricocheted or been partially deflected, exactly as the theory said they should be. But 3 had achieved clean penetration, burning through the steel as if it were fabric. The locations were not random. They were precisely targeted at the turret ring, where the armor was thinnest, at the fuel cells, where fire could spread most easily, at the ammunition storage, where a spark could trigger a catastrophic explosion. These were the weak points of the design. "The Americans are not shooting to damage and retreat," one of the senior mechanics, a man named Orlov, who had 15 years of armor experience, observed, while running his hand along the penetration holes. "They are shooting to kill. They are studying the armor. They are finding the weak points. They are planning each shot as if they were surgeons performing an operation." Danilov ordered them to open the tank completely, cutting away the interior panels and examining the internal layout. Inside, the space was cramped and dark, and obviously designed by engineers in Moscow, who had apparently never considered crew comfort as anything but a secondary concern. The ammunition racks were positioned precariously on the turret walls, accessible only with difficulty. The loader's position was so confined that moving a shell from storage to the breech required incredible effort and contortions. During extended combat operations, the loader would be exhausted within hours. The gun sight was crude, a simple optical arrangement that would have been adequate in static defensive positions, but which offered poor situational awareness when the tank was moving over broken terrain. The engine compartment was cramped. The cooling system was inadequate for sustained operations. Everything was designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to pack as much firepower as possible into the smallest possible package. At 5:15 p.m., Danilov ordered them to bring an American M4 Sherman tank to the same location. When it arrived, driven by an American sergeant who seemed bemused by the presence of Soviet advisors examining his vehicle, the contrast was immediate and almost shocking in its clarity. The American tank was taller, boxier, visibly less elegant than the T-34. On paper, it was inferior in almost every respect: armor thickness, gunpowder, speed, operational range. But inside, the difference transcended mere specifications. The turret was spacious enough that a man could stand upright. The loader's position was elevated on a turntable that rotated smoothly, allowing him to access ammunition racks with minimal effort. Shells could be moved from storage to the breech with efficiency. The gun sight was more sophisticated, with better magnification and a mechanical rangefinder that would have been considered advanced for the era. Most strikingly, the gunner's position was elevated relative to the rest of the turret, giving him superior visibility through the periscope and superior ability to acquire targets quickly. "It is not a tank," Danilov found himself saying in Russian to his adjutant, Major Petrov, as they stood between the two vehicles in the cold bunker. "It is a philosophy made of steel. The Soviet philosophy is that the machine serves the state. The crew is consumable. This tank is designed to be as small as possible and as cheap to produce as possible. Send more of them. The American philosophy is different. The machine serves the crew. The crew is valuable. This tank is larger and more expensive, but the crew inside it can remain effective for much longer. A crew that remains effective kills more enemies than a fresh crew in a broken machine." Danilov ordered a series of interrogations of American prisoners and sympathetic Chinese liaison officers who had worked with the Americans. He was not asking about tactics or strategy. He was asking about crew experience and endurance. The answers that came back over the next few days were damning to every Soviet assumption. The M4 Sherman was not supposed to be in service as long as it was, the American prisoners explained. Most of these particular tanks had been in continuous operation since 1942. They had worn engines, worn transmissions, worn optical systems. They should have been pulled from service years ago. But American tanks crews, unlike their Chinese counterparts or Soviet crews in doctrine, had been maintaining the same vehicles, rotating individual crew members for rest and recuperation, but never completely replacing the tanks. The crews had accumulated thousands upon thousands of hours of practical experience, operating in various terrain types. They had developed instincts about how their vehicles would behave over mountains and through valleys. They had learned to read the Korean landscape and position themselves not for direct frontal fire engagements, but for ambush. They had learned to use the poor visibility characteristics of the T-34 against its crews, to avoid head-to-head confrontations and instead to place themselves on favorable terrain where the Soviet tanks could not effectively depress their guns. Most disturbingly to Danilov, the American crews had begun to coordinate their movements with a sophistication that suggested real initiative rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. Where Chinese armor attacked in large numbers, American tankers would select defensive positions, not on the crest of hills, but slightly back from the crest, using the reverse slope to shield their vulnerable hulls, while keeping their gun turrets exposed above the ridgeline. The Chinese would attack the position. The American guns would take them under fire from protected positions, and by the time the Chinese commanders could organize a response and move their supporting armor into position, the Americans would have relocated to another, carefully chosen piece of terrain. It was not a tactic that was theoretically supposed to work against the numerical superiority of the T-34. It was a tactic that only worked if the crews operating the defending tanks were individually skilled and acting with tactical initiative rather than simply following rigid doctrine transmitted from a distant headquarters. At 8 p.m. on December 3rd, word arrived that the American forces were beginning a breakout attempt. The relief column had broken through from the south. Instead of continuing to defend their positions, the Americans were beginning a fighting withdrawal. Danilov expected them to collapse under the pressure. He expected the superior numbers to finally tell. But what he witnessed over the next 48 hours was something he had never seen before. A withdrawal executed with such precision and such discipline that he found himself developing something like grudging respect for the enemy. The Americans had taken their tanks, their infantry, their wounded, and extracted them from a position that should have been untenable. They had lost tanks, they had lost men. Many had died, but they had not been destroyed. The Chinese force, despite its overwhelming numerical superiority, and despite possessing armor that was theoretically invulnerable on paper, had failed to achieve decisive victory. The mathematical certainty had failed. Danilov's final report to Moscow took nearly a month to draft. The conclusions he reached were deeply troubling to him, not because they reflected poorly on Soviet equipment — the T-34 was magnificent — but because they reflected poorly on Soviet military doctrine as a whole. The T-34 was a magnificent tank. It was superior to the American M4 in almost every measurable specification. The gun was more powerful, the armor was better sloped, the speed was higher. But the American M4, operated by crews who had been trained to think independently, who had been encouraged to adapt to circumstances, who had actual room to work in comfort and could therefore remain effective for longer periods of combat, had proven to be more effective in the conditions that actually pertained on the Korean peninsula. The mathematics of warfare, Danilov concluded in his report, is not just about numbers of tanks. It is about the efficiency with which those numbers translate into actual combat power. It is about how long a crew can remain effective. It is about whether that crew has been trained to think or trained to obey. An army of 100 men operating independently and adapting to unexpected circumstances can outfight an army of 1,000 men operating under rigid command structures, because the rigid command structure collapses the moment reality deviates from what was planned back in Moscow. The Americans had adapted. The Chinese, constrained by rigid adherence to Soviet tactical templates and doctrine, had not. This was the real lesson. This was what haunted Danilov as he prepared to return to the Soviet Union. Not crack that American equipment was better, but that American doctrine, their philosophy of warfare itself, was superior in ways that no amount of tank armor could overcome.